Welcome, friends. You're watching Animal Attacks. Today, I'll be covering 6 people who used an animal to kill somebody and thought it would pass for an accident. Beginning with the millionaire and the lions behind his own house. The evening of September 12, 2018 was cooling off fast on a private game farm in the north of South Africa. 40,000 acres behind a game fence with a house on the high ground in the middle of it. Warwick Delacroix walked his wife down the track toward the lion enclosure a little after 6, the way he had walked her down there most evenings that week to watch the feed. He was 56 years old. Adele Delacroix was 52. She went through the inner gate ahead of him and he closed it behind her. Warwick had made his money in mining supply and had bought the farm 9 years earlier when the money was at its best. The lions were the reason people knew who he was. There were 4 of them in a holding enclosure near the house, 3 females and a male, bought as cubs from a breeding operation and raised on the property. The 2 men who worked the farm had a standing rule drilled into them the way it is drilled into anybody around captive lions, that nobody went past the outer gate while the animals were in the enclosure. Warwick was the one person on the property who ignored it because he owned the place and because he had convinced himself out loud and often that the lions were different with him. That is the first thing anybody learns around big cats, and it is why the whole system of gates exists. A captive lion stays a wild animal that has simply lost its fear of people, which is worse than a wild one having it, because that fear was the only thing keeping the distance. Every enclosure of that kind has a double gate, an outer and an inner, so that no single mistake can put a person in with the animals. Keepers shift the lions into a holding pen before anybody goes in to clean or repair anything. A captive lion never becomes tame. It only loses its fear of you. And that fear was all that kept the distance. The marriage had been finished for about 2 years, in every way except the legal one. There was a prenuptial agreement that did not work the way Warwick had assumed it worked, an estate that a divorce would have cut roughly in half, and a life policy on Adele that he had increased 14 months before that evening. It was the oldest arithmetic there is. A divorce cost him half of everything he had spent 30 years building. A funeral cost him nothing and paid out. He had also spent about 3 weeks quietly building the story he intended to tell afterward, the part of this that took planning rather than nerve. He took Adele down there every evening he could and made a point of it in front of the 2 men who worked the farm. And he told them, and a neighbor who farmed the next property, that she had become fascinated by the lions and had been getting careless around them. That is a thing a person only says in advance. What happened at the gate took a few seconds. He had the outer gate open and the inner gate unlatched, and that does not happen by accident, because those 2 gates are latched separately and deliberately every time by anybody who goes near them. Unlatching both takes more than carelessness. It is a decision made twice. She stepped into the space between them, and he put a hand on her back and put her through the inner one, and then he shut it. She was in there for a second or 2 before anything moved, standing in a space she had stood beside 100 times with a fence in between. The lions were about 90 feet away, and they came immediately. Adele got perhaps 2 steps back toward the gate. The male reached her first and put her down, and the 3 females came in on top of that within a second of each other. And what happens after that with 4 adult lions on one person is not something anybody comes back from and is not slow enough to be interrupted. There was a rifle in the vehicle at the top of the track. It was not brought down. Warwick watched all of it from about 15 feet away on the other side of the fence, then went back up to the house, and it was closer to 7 minutes before his call went through. He told the operator he had run for the equipment shed first, looking for the spare set of keys to the far gate, and then gone to that gate itself and tried it and found it wouldn't budge. He told 3 separate people beforehand that she was getting careless around the lions. That is a thing a person only says in advance. His story was that Adele had entered the enclosure alone while he remained at the house, used the gates incorrectly, and that he only reached the scene after hearing her scream, then failed to open the second gate in time. The account held briefly but collapsed under the evidence. Both gates were found unlatched, even though anyone familiar with big cat enclosures would have secured the outer gate before opening the inner one. Two farm workers also confirmed that Warwick, not Adele, had escorted her to the enclosure every evening in the weeks before her death. Investigators later tested the second gate and found it opened and closed normally, with no mechanical fault. His phone added more inconsistencies. Cell tower records placed it near the enclosure, not at the house, in the minutes before the emergency call. An automatically backed up photo showed him standing at the fence line 6 minutes before reporting the attack. His timeline also changed during later interviews, including details about which gate he approached and when he arrived. Warwick filed a claim on Adele's life insurance 6 days after her death, before investigators had challenged his account. He was arrested 9 days after the attack and convicted the following year of murder and insurance fraud. The next one used an animal that does its work slowly, which turned out to be the entire point of choosing it. The night of April 18th, 2020, was hot and dry in a town in Rajasthan, in India, in a house where two business partners were sleeping after a long day of not agreeing about money. Vikram Solanki was asleep in the front room. Devendra Ratti was on the floor of the back room. And at some point in the small hours, a saw-scaled viper bit him twice on the forearm. The two men had run a stone yard together for 6 years, and the partnership had gone bad in the most ordinary way there is. One of them had been taking money out of it for a long time, and the other had finally worked out how much. There was a meeting scheduled for that week with somebody from outside the family who was going to look at the books line by line for the first time in 6 years. Vikram Solanki had about 9 days before a stranger opened those ledgers. The saw-scaled viper is a small snake, about 1.5 feet of it. It is one of the 4 species behind the great majority of snake bite deaths in India. And of those 4, it is the one people are least likely to name, because inside that country, the Russell's viper kills several times more. A saw-scaled viper does not kill a man in minutes. It takes a day or more, and that is precisely why it got chosen. Vikram did not have to hunt one down specially or handle something he'd never handled before. He worked a stone yard in dry country, and a stone yard is stacked rubble and cut block with gaps all through it, which is about as close to purpose-built habitat for that species as anything a person could put up. Most of the men who worked that ground killed a snake when they found one, or left it and called someone else. Vikram was the exception. He'd had a scare as a younger man and taught himself to handle them properly rather than avoid them. And he kept a hook and a bag by the office door, the way other men keep a broom, something the rest of the yard thought was a little strange about him. Turning up a saw-scaled viper on his own was not unusual. Turning one up the day before his partner died was. He put it on Devendra in the dark, and then he let it go over the back wall into the same rubble it had likely come from. There was never a snake to find, and the investigation was never going to be built around one. That absence is why it took investigators longer, and it is also what the delay ended up proving. When Devendra woke him at 4 a.m. with an arm swelling up, Vikram agreed it was a snake. He told him it wasn't as bad as it looked. He sent for a local healer known in the area for treating bites with herbs and waited through the hour and a half that took. And by the time it was clear that wasn't working, he said the district hospital was too far to reach in time and that a smaller clinic nearby would do just as well. He drove him there. It had no antivenom, which everybody in that district knew, and he stayed while a doctor with nothing to give did what he could and kept saying Devendra seemed to be holding on. Devendra Ratti died the following evening, about 30 hours after he was bitten, 4 miles from a refrigerator that had what he needed. Somewhere in those 30 hours, there was a long stretch in which almost any decision made in good faith would have saved him. He got him to a clinic with no antivenom and then told everyone the true hospital was too far. The delay was the murder, and the snake was the excuse. The thing that got people looking was the bite itself. A saw-scaled viper strikes low at whatever disturbs it, at an ankle or a foot or a hand put down on the floor. And Devendra had 2 punctures on the forearm, higher than the species usually reaches on a sleeping man. The doctor who saw that arm wrote it down as odd on the first day. Odd is all it was. What settled it was everything after the bite. His phone put him a full 90 minutes at the healer's house. He never mentioned to police. And a fuel stop and 2 people at the roadside placed him on a route that took him past the turning for the district hospital, the one he'd called too far, on both trips. His own account of the night shifted in 3 separate retellings, about when he'd woken, about who'd suggested the healer, about whether he'd known Devendra was getting worse. None of it was one thing. It was all of it together. Vikram Solanki was convicted of murder. The next man picked the one animal he was certain would leave nothing to examine, and he was wrong about that. The morning of October 2nd, 2015, was already warm on a crocodile farm outside Darwin, in the Northern Territory of Australia, where 600 saltwater crocodiles live across dozens of individual concrete and wire pens strung along a row of walkways, most holding only a handful of animals apiece. Nathan Purcell found the gate on Pen 11 standing open at first light, and his business partner was not in his house and had not slept in it. Craig Tolley had been inside that pen since about 10 o'clock the night before. The 2 of them had built the farm over 14 years from almost nothing, and by that year, it was carrying debt it could not service, and they had stopped being able to be in a room together. There was a key man insurance policy on each of them, taken out when they still liked each other, and it is an ordinary thing for a business that size to hold, and an extraordinary thing to be holding on the morning one partner turns up in a crocodile pen. A saltwater crocodile is the largest reptile alive, and the pens on a farm like that hold animals up to 16 or 17 feet. What a crocodile does with something it takes at the water's edge is drag it under, roll until whatever it has hold of comes apart, and then hold what is left underwater in a place of its own choosing. 14 years around those animals told him a pen was a place a body disappears. 14 years had taught him the wrong lesson. Nathan's plan was never as simple as believing the crocodiles would erase a body outright. And 14 years in the trade meant he knew better than that. What he was counting on was everything around them, that the animals sharing Pen 11, working over what they'd taken the way they always did, would break down and scatter anything left. That the tropical heat would finish what the water started long before a pen was ever drained. That whatever turned up weeks later, waterlogged and picked over, would be too far gone to say anything useful about how a man had died. Craig Tolley went into that pen at night, and everything about it was wrong from the first hour anybody looked properly. The walkway gates on a farm like that are padlocked, and the padlock on Pen 11 was found hanging open and undamaged, and there are 3 keys to it. He had no reason to be in there at 10 at night, and the feed was not due. He walked down from his own house in shorts and rubber sandals. A man who has worked crocodiles for 14 years does not step into a pen in sandals, or at night, or at all, because the whole farm is laid out, so nobody ever has to be on the same side of the wire as the animals. A crocodile cannot open a padlock, and it cannot close a gate behind itself. Everything about that pen was somebody else's work. Nathan had gone out to the pens at about 9:30 and told the police he had not. A fuel receipt from a station on the highway put him 10 miles away at the time he claimed to be asleep, and it was the receipt that started it, because he had produced it himself for a different reason entirely. The pen was drained over 2 days, a slow and unpleasant job done with the animals moved off and held elsewhere. And it is a job that gets done every time, which Nathan knew perfectly well. What was recovered was enough to work with, as it usually is. The feed log did the rest. Pen 11 had gone into that day carrying almost double its usual ration, logged by Nathan the previous afternoon as a routine top-up, and the 2 pens either side of it, due to be fed on the same round, had been skipped entirely that day, with no note explaining why. He had also put the feed in the corner nearest the walkway gate rather than his usual spread across the pen, so the animals would already be clustered there when the gate opened rather than scattered through the water. Nathan Purcell was convicted of murder 4 years later, after an investigation that moved slowly because nearly all of it had to be built from records rather than from a scene. The crocodiles were not destroyed. They had been in a locked pen, being crocodiles in the place crocodiles were kept. The next one did not need to touch anybody at all. He only had to open a chain at the right time of year. The morning of June 21st, 2017 was thick and wet in a village in northern Thailand at a camp where 11 elephants were kept for tourists and forest work. Somchai Prathrang was found on the ground inside the camp perimeter a little after 6 in the morning by a man arriving to start the day's feeding. A bull named Khan had been loose since some point in the night, and Khan had been in must for 11 days. Somchai Prathrang had run the camp with a partner for years, and there had been a long, slow fight over the elephants and the money, of the kind that goes on so long everybody around it stops noticing. The man he had been fighting with was Wichai Bunmi, who worked the same camp, had brought the bull Khan on from a calf, and knew that animal better than anybody alive. Elephants of that age are worth a great deal, and the argument had come down to which of them owned which ones. Must is what makes this one work. A bull elephant goes into it once a year and stays in it for weeks, with testosterone many times what he normally carries. And during that period, he is aggressive, unpredictable, and effectively unmanageable. Every camp in that part of the world handles it the same way. They chain him, feed him at a distance, and wait it out. Mahouts get killed by their own elephants during must more than at any other time of year. And everybody in that trade knows a man it happened to. A bull in the muth cannot be managed. Every camp does the same thing, which is to chain him and wait several weeks for it to pass. So a loose bull in must inside a camp at night needs no instruction from anybody. It produces a dead man on its own, which is why it is such a clean thing to arrange and why it took a while for anybody to look past it. An elephant killing a mahout in must season is one of the most ordinary deaths in that industry. Khan was chained on 2 legs with heavy chain running to driven stakes, standard practice done to that animal every must season of his life. The chain on the back leg was found lying on the ground in the morning. It had not broken, the ring had not failed, and the elephant had not pulled the stake out because the stake was still standing with the chain beside it. The link at the end had been cut cleanly through in one place by something with far more leverage and precision than an elephant. A chain an animal has broken does not look like that, and any mahout in that country can tell the difference across a yard. From there, the case was built the way these cases usually are, in layers rather than on one detail alone. A pair of heavy-duty industrial-grade bolt cutters recovered from Wichai's shed, the kind sold for cutting chain and rebar rather than the light pair any hardware shop stocks, produced tool marks that a forensic examiner testified were consistent with the cut on the link, though she was careful on the stand to say consistent, not conclusive on its own. Camp CCTV, aimed mostly at the tourist enclosure but catching the edge of the mahout's quarters, placed him near Khan's stake a little after 2 in the morning, hours after he told police he was asleep. His phone had been left at his house, which by itself would have meant nothing, except that a neighbor 2 lanes over remembered seeing him on the path without it, an odd enough thing in a village that small to be remembered. Metallurgical testing on the chain ruled out fatigue or a manufacturing flaw, which closed off the one explanation his lawyers tried hardest to keep open. And 2 other camp workers said separately what everyone there already knew without saying it aloud. Wichai was the only person on the camp experienced enough to approach Khan with the extreme caution must demanded at any time of year. He was the only man in that camp with the skill to get near the bull in must at all. That and the bolt cutters and the footage and the chain was what convicted him. Wihai Bumi had bought that set of bolt cutters 8 weeks before the killing from an industrial supplier 2 towns over. A strange enough purchase for a man who had no chain cutting job on the camp to justify it. Cone was not destroyed. The next man used something that weighs 1/10 of an ounce, which is all he needed to weigh. The afternoon of May 30th, 2013 was hot in the brush country of South Texas, on a piece of family land with 8 beehives on the back of it. Dale Rusk was found beside his truck about 200 yards from the hives, with his face and neck swollen past recognition. He was 47 years old. He had been severely allergic to bee venom since he was 9 years old, when it had nearly killed him the first time. And every single person in that family knew it because it was the kind of thing a family organizes itself around for 4 decades. His brother Merle kept the hives and had kept bees on that land for 11 years. The two of them had been fighting over the property for 3 years, since their mother died and left it in a way that made both of them right and neither able to do anything, the worst possible outcome of a will. Dale had filed to force a sale 6 weeks before he died, and a forced sale would have taken the hives, the shed, the water, and the only thing Merle had. Anaphylaxis is what makes this one possible. A person with a severe venom allergy does not die from the venom itself in any ordinary sense. Their own immune system goes into a reaction that closes the airway and drops the blood pressure in minutes rather than hours. One thing reverses it: a shot of epinephrine delivered fast. A person living with an allergy like that carries an injector everywhere and knows precisely where it is at every moment, the way other people know where their keys are. Dale kept one in the glove box and one in a kitchen drawer, and had done for 38 years. A stink that size kills a man like that through his own immune system in about 10 minutes, and only one thing on earth stops it. The hives on that land were Africanized, as a great many are along that stretch of the border, and an Africanized colony reacts hardest in the minutes right after it's been disturbed, and stays keyed up as long as something keeps disturbing it. Merle worked the lids of 2 hives loose 3 separate times in the half hour before Dale was due, each time letting them settle a little and then jarring them again, enough to keep the colony boiling without ever fully opening a box or leaving the kind of damage anybody would look at twice. By the time Dale walked past them that afternoon, they were already running hot, and nothing about the hives themselves would have told an investigator that a person had been there. Dale was there that morning because his brother had asked him to be. There was a call at 7:40, the first contact between them in 5 weeks, about walking the boundary before the sale went through. None of this depended on catching a man on a day he happened to wander past the hives. Merle picked the morning and made the appointment. And by the time his brother arrived, both of Dale's epinephrine injectors were already gone from where they'd sat for years, one from the truck's glove box and one from the kitchen drawer, taken during the 2 hours Merle had spent alone in the house 4 days earlier. Somebody had unsaddled 2 hives with nothing that would show, and then made sure the one thing that could save him wasn't there to find. Dale ran for the truck. That much was clear from where he was found, close enough to it that reaching the glove box should have taken him seconds. What the scene showed was a man who had gotten to exactly the place he needed to be and found nothing there. There was no injector on the ground beside him, fired or otherwise, because there was nothing left in that glove box to fire. What convicted Merle was built up from several directions at once. Text messages recovered from Dale's phone showed Merle setting the exact time of the visit 2 days earlier, unusual after 5 weeks of silence between them. A neighbor driving past that morning remembered seeing Merle's truck parked near the hives well before Dale's appointment, earlier than any normal check of the boxes would call for. Merle's fingerprints turned up on the hive lids in a pattern consistent with someone working them loose rather than performing routine maintenance, which typically leaves prints on the frames inside, not the lid edges. and on a shared family computer, investigators found search history from the week before, deleted but recovered, on anaphylaxis, on how long a reaction takes, and on how far a person could be expected to get once a sting hits. He was convicted of murder, and the case came together once the messages, the fingerprints, and the deleted searches were laid out together. The last one used an animal most people in that valley did not know he owned. The evening of March 8th, 2021 was cold and wet in a rural stretch of northern Spain, on a property that held a licensed private collection of exotic animals, among them 2 Bengal tigers. Tomás Reina drove up a little before 9 at the invitation of the man who owned the place, parked in the yard, and walked in through the front of the animal house with him. He did not walk back out. The feud was about a right-of-way across the bottom of one property and had been through the courts twice, and it had produced the things these feuds produce. There had been a barn fire nobody was ever charged for, and a dead horse nobody was ever charged for either. Ismael Baraya and Tomás Reina had not spoken directly in 4 years and had done all of it through lawyers, which is why the phone call at 20 past 8 that evening mattered so much. The collection was legal and inspected, and Ismael had held the license for 11 years. The tigers had come to him as surplus from a circus that folded, and they were the reason people in the area either admired him or thought he was mad. A tiger is the largest cat alive, and a grown male runs to 500 pounds. What matters here is how it is built to work, because a tiger is an ambush animal that does not chase things across open ground. It closes the distance in cover and takes the back of the neck or the throat in a single rush from a few yards. A captive tiger, fed by the same person for years, is not a safe animal, and everybody holding a license for one is told so repeatedly. It is habituated to one man in one routine, and anybody else standing where he does not expect a person is something that has appeared inside the enclosure. A captive tiger is habituated to one man in one routine. Anybody else in its space is not a keeper to it. The building was laid out the way these are, with a service corridor behind the enclosures, so food and water go in through hatches without anybody sharing a space with the animals. Between that corridor and the enclosure is a steel slide gate raised by a hand winch with a ratchet on it, by a person turning a handle a number of times. That detail decided the case, but it took a week to matter. The two of them walked down the corridor. There were 2 winches on that wall, one for each enclosure, mounted close together, and Ismael afterwards said he had grabbed the wrong handle in the dark, meaning to check a hatch on the empty side and instead raising the gate on the occupied one. It is a far more believable account than a gate lifting itself, and it is the kind of mistake that does happen around equipment like that, which is exactly why it took investigators longer to rule out. That corridor is a concrete channel about 4 feet wide, wall on one side and cage on the other, one door at each end. Tomás Reina was closer to the enclosure and further from the near door. The gate came up. The larger of the 2 tigers was through it inside a couple of seconds, because there was an opening in its enclosure that had never been opened before and a stranger standing in the gap. It took him against the wall and put him down, and a 4-foot corridor gives a man nothing to do and nowhere to go, and the second animal came through behind the first. It was finished long before anybody could have reached them, and nobody tried, because there was nobody else on the property. A service corridor is 4 feet wide, wall on one side and cage on the other. There's nothing a man does in there when a gate comes up. Ismael Baraya called it in himself and told the story about grabbing the wrong winch, and for about a week it was treated as a keeping accident, which does happen at private collections, even to men who have held a license for 11 years. The winches ended it, not the gate. Each was tested separately, and each required a distinct, deliberate number of turns to lift fully. They did not sit close enough together to grab one while reaching for the other without noticing the difference in resistance almost immediately. And the pawl on the gate that had opened was found seated with the gate up which is where a person leaves it once they've finished winding, not where a hand pulled away in surprise leaves it. The collection's own movement records, which a license requires, showed both tigers had been shifted into that section that morning, logged as a routine husbandry transfer for enclosure cleaning. Investigators found no cleaning had been scheduled or carried out, and no reason for the transfer at all, beyond moving both animals to the one section with a corridor door closer to the enclosure than to the way out. And there was the call, 4 years into a silence, asking a man up to the property after dark. A routine transfer with nothing to clean and no reason behind it. Somebody had decided that morning exactly where those tigers needed to be. Ismael Baraya was convicted of murder. The 2 tigers were not destroyed, and it was never seriously considered because an animal that walks through an opening somebody made for it has done nothing but be a tiger. They were moved to a licensed facility elsewhere in the country, where both are still alive, and the collection was closed and the license taken away for good.